What would you do if a single phone call could decide the fate of your nation? At 3:17 a.m., silence covered Ouagadougou. Then the phone rang inside the presidential residence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. On the line was Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. His voice was sharp and cold. His words were not diplomacy. They were a threat. Restore our mining contracts. Reopen our surveillance ties. You have 48 hours. 48 hours. 2 days to bow or be broken. Billions of dollars in gold and energy were at stake, but the real price was far greater. The sovereignty of Burkina Faso, the dignity of its people, and the future of Africa itself. Traoré did not flinch. His answer cut through the night like steel. I don't negotiate with extortionists. No hesitation, no fear, just clarity. In that moment, the countdown began, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Washington, Tel Aviv, Moscow, and Beijing. In the Pentagon, generals warned that Burkina Faso could become a new anti-Western fortress in the Sahel. At the State Department, diplomats feared losing influence to Russia and China. On American television, commentators asked, had the West underestimated this young African captain? Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, families prayed in silence. Students whispered about resistance. Ministers replayed the ultimatum, knowing the next 48 hours would shape not only their country, but the entire continent's struggle for independence. This is not just a story of contracts and politics. It is a fight for dignity, survival, and freedom. If you believe sovereignty is not for sale, stay with us. Watch closely, reflect deeply, and share this story, because what happens in these 48 hours could change Africa forever. The ultimatum replayed again and again inside the walls of the presidential palace. Around a long wooden table, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with his most trusted ministers, the defense chief, the intelligence director, the foreign affairs minister. Their faces were tense, their eyes fixed on the recording of Netanyahu's voice. It was not diplomacy. It was coercion. 48 hours to comply or face consequences. For several minutes, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, like a verdict hanging over the nation. Finally, the intelligence director broke the quiet. This is not about mining contracts. This is about dismantling sovereignty. Heads nodded around the table. Everyone knew the stakes. 2 scenarios lay before them. The first, resignation. Traoré could step down, hand power to a transitional authority, and restore foreign contracts worth more than $1.2 billion. The cost? National humiliation, but with the promise of so-called safety. The second, resistance. To stand firm meant preparing for sanctions, cyber attacks, propaganda campaigns, and political isolation. Economists warned that sanctions alone could cut Burkina Faso's GDP by 4 to 6% every year, draining hundreds of millions from reserves. A new wave of capital flight could bleed the nation dry. The defense minister leaned forward. His voice was steady but fierce. Dependence is already killing us slowly. To step down now would only formalize our subordination. Around the table, grim nods followed. Could freedom ever be won without paying a price? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington was divided. In the Pentagon, generals argued that if Traoré resisted, Burkina Faso might turn into a base for Russian and Chinese influence in West Africa. At the State Department, diplomats warned that crushing him could ignite a wave of anti-Western resistance across the Sahel. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers argued on cable news. Some called for tighter sanctions, while others asked why America was entangled in a fight over mines in a distant land. Back in Ouagadougou, the tension spilled into the streets. Word of the ultimatum leaked, and instead of panic, it sparked unity. Students painted banners reading, "Our land, our choice." Women left markets, banging pots and pans like drums of defiance. Workers walked off their jobs to gather in public squares. In a country where many live on less than $3 a day, giving up daily wages was not easy. But they came anyway. Because this was not just about contracts, it was about dignity. Across radios, preachers reminded congregations better to suffer with honor than live without freedom. Families prayed together in candlelight, while youth groups organized vigils and marches. The message was spreading. Sovereignty is not negotiable. And then came the first moves on the global chessboard. Traoré reached out beyond Africa. Phone calls went out to Caracas, Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing. Venezuela offered political solidarity. Iran sent cyber defense units, warning that without protection, digital sabotage could wipe out $500 million in annual banking flows. Russia dispatched military advisors, not to invade, but to train and strategize. China provided the most tangible relief, an emergency credit line of $1 billion, enough to stabilize Burkina Faso's reserves for 18 months. In Washington, the news hit hard. Think tanks like Brookings and CSIS warned, if this spreads, the U.S. will lose Africa for a generation. Media commentators debated whether Traoré was reckless or courageous. The White House chose silence, watching the clock tick closer to midnight. But silence could not stop what was happening in the streets of Ouagadougou. Crowds grew larger. Farmers, shopkeepers, construction workers, entire neighborhoods poured out, chanting, "We choose Traoré, not Tel Aviv." Drone footage captured waves of people filling the capital, their voices echoing like thunder. What was meant to intimidate one man had become a public reckoning for an entire nation. But here is the question. Would unity at home and support abroad be enough to shield Burkina Faso from the storm about to descend? Or would the weight of sanctions, cyber attacks, and pressure from Washington eventually break the resistance? The 48 hours passed, but the consequences had only begun. On the surface, Burkina Faso stood taller than before. But beneath the pride and unity, daily life was changing in ways both visible and painful. Markets in Ouagadougou buzzed with energy, but also with worry. Imported goods, fuel, sugar, and medicine rose sharply in price. Merchants explained that foreign banks were freezing transactions, cutting vital supply lines. A father buying rice for his family said quietly, "We are proud, yes." But food costs twice as much now. For families surviving on less than $3 a day, even small increases were devastating. In villages across the countryside, young men debated whether to stay or to leave. Migration had long been an escape from poverty, but now it became a question of survival. Rumors spread that new sanctions could push thousands to seek work in neighboring countries. At the same time, militias loyal to Traoré began training recruits, insisting that sovereignty must be defended not just with words, but with arms if necessary. Inside the government, the atmosphere was equally intense. Ministers worked around the clock, drafting emergency measures to stabilize the economy. New trade routes were opened through Mali and Niger. Community savings networks were promoted as substitutes for frozen banking channels. Economists calculated that even with sanctions, if regional cooperation held firm, Burkina Faso could avoid collapse. But it would mean hardship for ordinary citizens, shortages, higher prices, and a slower recovery. Politically, the ultimatum had redrawn the map. Traoré, once seen by outsiders as an inexperienced captain, now appeared to many as a symbol of African dignity. Across the continent, activists compared him to Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkinabe leader who challenged colonial influence decades earlier. But inside Burkina Faso, voices of caution also emerged. Some intellectuals warned, "Defiance is powerful, but without a clear plan for growth, pride alone will not feed the people." Meanwhile, Washington faced its own political storm. Lawmakers grilled officials on live television. How did the U.S. allow a small nation like Burkina Faso to resist and inspire half a continent? Some argued for harsher sanctions and covert operations. Others admitted privately that intimidation no longer worked the way it once did. On talk shows, Americans over 60, veterans, retirees, church leaders, debated whether the United States should focus on its own problems instead of pressuring African states. For ordinary Burkinabe, however, the debate was not abstract, it was personal. A mother of 3 in Bobo Dioulasso said, "We will eat less, we will suffer more, but at least our children will know we stood with dignity." Teachers used the events as lessons in classrooms, telling students that sovereignty was not just a word but a sacrifice. Community leaders organized prayer meetings, asking for strength to endure what was coming. And yet, even as hardships grew, so did pride. Resistance became a cultural force. Musicians released songs with lyrics declaring, "48 hours means 48 years." Graffiti artists painted murals of Traoré standing tall against foreign leaders. Children chanted slogans of unity in schoolyards. For the first time in years, a sense of national identity seemed stronger than fear. Internationally, the shockwaves continued. Ghana's parliament passed a resolution condemning foreign intimidation. Mali and Niger announced new military coordination with Burkina Faso, calling their alliance the Sahel Shield. In Chad and Nigeria, civil society groups organized solidarity marches. Even the African Union, often seen as slow and divided, accelerated talks on economic independence. But challenges remained. Western disinformation campaigns painted Traoré as reckless. Cyber attacks disrupted government servers. Foreign investors paused projects. The road ahead was uncertain. Could Burkina Faso survive a long struggle, or would unity fade as shortages deepened? In the palace, Traoré met with advisors late into the night. He reminded them of history. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. All had faced external pressure, and many had paid with their lives. "If we must suffer," he told them, "let it be for dignity." Sovereignty is not negotiable, but here lies the deeper question. Can dignity alone sustain a nation under siege? Or will the weight of economic pain eventually test the very unity that defiance has created? In Washington, the 48-hour showdown was more than a foreign policy crisis. It became a political earthquake. Inside the Pentagon, generals warned that Burkina Faso's defiance could inspire a wave of resistance across Africa. "If one small nation can say no," one official remarked privately, "what happens when 5 or 10 follow?" The State Department, on the other hand, urged caution. Diplomats argued that intimidation had backfired and that sanctions were only fueling anti-American sentiment. On Capitol Hill, hearings turned heated. Lawmakers grilled administration officials live on television. One senator demanded, "How can a captain from a country with less than 20 million people defy us and win?" Another fired back, "Maybe the question is not about him. Maybe the question is about us." The divide was clear. Hawks wanted to double down with more pressure, while moderates feared America was losing moral credibility. American media added fuel to the fire. CNN ran headlines about Africa's young strong man. Fox News warned viewers that Traoré was opening doors to Russia and China. Meanwhile, independent outlets asked a more uncomfortable question. Why are ordinary Africans cheering him in the streets while booing the West? On talk radio, older Americans, veterans, church leaders, working-class retirees, debated fiercely. Some called Traoré reckless, others admired his courage, comparing him to leaders of America's own independence story. Globally, the ripple was undeniable. In Moscow, analysts celebrated what they called the breaking of Western pressure. Beijing quietly expanded trade talks with African states, presenting itself as a stable alternative to the dollar. In Caracas and Tehran, officials praised Burkina Faso as proof that resistance could work. In Europe, unease grew. Some leaders feared that if the United States appeared weak in Africa, Europe's own influence would collapse next. At the United Nations, Traoré himself stood at the podium. His speech was calm, not fiery, but firm. "We are not anti-anyone. We are pro-dignity, pro-sovereignty, and pro-democracy." His words echoed across the chamber. Delegates from Africa applauded. Western diplomats sat in uneasy silence. But the question lingered. Was this only a symbolic win for Burkina Faso? Or had the world just witnessed the birth of a new chapter in global power politics? The 48 hours ended not with bombs, not with soldiers, but with silence. What was meant to intimidate Burkina Faso had collapsed into retreat. The ultimatum that once sounded unstoppable dissolved into nothing. For the people of Ouagadougou, it was not just survival. It was victory. Spirit over fear. Dignity over coercion. But victories carry consequences. Almost immediately, new forms of pressure arrived. Disinformation campaigns spread across social media, painting Traoré as reckless. Cyber attacks attempted to cripple banks and government servers. Western financial institutions froze accounts, cutting tens of millions of dollars in transactions. Each blow was designed to suffocate. Yet Burkina Faso adapted, rerouting communications, building savings networks, and standing firm. Across Africa, the Ouagadougou effect grew louder. In Nigeria, students waved Burkinabe flags. In Mali, leaders declared, "Touch Burkina Faso, you touch us all." Ghana's parliament condemned foreign intimidation. Even the African Union, often slow to act, passed a resolution declaring sovereignty non-negotiable. For the first time in decades, Africa seemed to be moving with one voice. Still, dangers remain. History warns us that when African leaders defy outside powers, they often face more than sanctions. They face destabilization, coups, and assassination. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, the pattern is familiar. Could Ibrahim Traoré be next on that list? Or will his defiance mark the turning point where Africa finally breaks the cycle? Economists already see the stakes. If African nations redirect even a quarter of their resource wealth toward local industry, they could add over $120 billion a year to their economies. That money could fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure instead of flowing overseas. But such a path demands unity, resilience, and sacrifice. And so, the 48 hours that began as a threat ended as a test. A test of one nation's courage. A test of Africa's solidarity. And perhaps a test of whether the world will continue to be ruled by fear or by dignity. Now the question passes to you. Is Captain Ibrahim Traoré a reckless gambler, or the spark of Africa's awakening? If you believe sovereignty is worth more than gold, share this story. Talk about it with your family. Reflect on it in your community. Because dignity is not an abstract idea. It is a choice we make and a legacy we leave.